They say weddings bring families together. But that day, mine broke apart in front of 200 guests. I was standing by the aisle holding the bouquet I'd made myself. My hands were shaking, not because of nerves, but pride. My only son, Michael, was getting married. And then it happened. I sat down in what I thought was my seat right in the front row. A moment later, my new daughter-in-law, Samantha, marched over, her face cold as glass, and before I could say a word, she slapped me. The music stopped. The cameras turned. Her parents, Elaine and Robert, laughed. Someone shouted, "Keep rolling," and just like that, my humiliation became their entertainment. I stood there frozen, my cheek burning, my heart louder than the applause that never came. That night I went home, or at least what I thought was still my home, but when I put my key in the door, it didn't fit. My name was gone from the deed. The bank said I'd signed it away. They took my house, my reputation, and even my son's trust. But they forgot one thing: I'm not as helpless as I look. Because what they started with a slap, I would finish with the truth. And when that truth came out, it wasn't me who'd be ashamed. It was them. Stay with me. And I'll tell you how I took back everything they stole, including the one thing they could never buy back: my dignity. My name is Helen Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and a widow of 10 years. I live in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business and where people remember you by how you behave, not by what you own. I've spent most of my life teaching other people's children how to express themselves while quietly swallowing my own pain. After my husband died, I poured every ounce of love and money I had into raising my son Michael. He was all I had left, and all I ever wanted was to see him happy. The morning of his wedding felt like a reward for all those years of sacrifice. I woke up early, even before the sun, because my nerves wouldn't let me sleep. I wanted everything to be perfect for him. I pressed my dress the night before, a soft blue one that Michael once said made me look calm like the ocean after a storm. That memory stayed with me as I brushed my hair, added a touch of lipstick, and pinned on the small brooch his father had given me on our own wedding day. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud. The ceremony was held at a vineyard just outside town, surrounded by early spring flowers. Rows of white chairs lined the grass, and strings of fairy lights hung between oak trees. Everything shimmered, and so did my heart. I kept telling myself, he's found someone to love him. That's all that matters. I'd met Samantha a few times before, the kind of woman who smiled politely, but always measured the room. Her parents, Elaine and Robert Pierce, were well-dressed, confident, and always seemed to talk just a little louder than everyone else. I tried not to mind. Families are different, I told myself. Maybe theirs just shows affection differently. I arrived early, gift in hand, a small box wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a key to the house Michael and I once shared, a symbolic gesture, I thought, to say that it now belonged to him and his new wife. I'd already transferred the wedding fund to his account, a gesture of faith. My heart was full, even if my savings were not. The wedding planner, a woman from Elaine's company, seemed nervous when I asked about the seating arrangement. "Mrs. Pierce told us you'd prefer to sit near the back for a better view," she said. I laughed softly, thinking she must have misunderstood. "I'm the groom's mother," I said gently. "I think I belong in the front." The woman blinked, her smile fading. "Oh, of course. Let me check." She hurried off, and I didn't think much of it. I just assumed weddings were chaotic. As guests began to arrive, I noticed Elaine whispering to the master of ceremonies, pointing at the printed programs. A few minutes later, I picked one up. My eyes froze. Under parents of the groom, there was no mention of me, only the late Mr. Whitmore. My breath caught, but I told myself not to make a scene. It must have been an oversight. I pressed the paper against my lap, folded it once, and smiled at the woman beside me, who commented on the weather. When the music started, everyone stood. Samantha looked beautiful, radiant under the sun, and Michael, my sweet boy, stood tall, nervous, but proud. My chest swelled with love. I wanted nothing more than to freeze that moment and forget all the awkward details. After the vows, when guests began moving toward the reception area, I looked for my seat at the front table. There were name cards, elegant and gold-edged. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Pierce, maid of honor. Best man. Then an empty chair, no card. I assumed it was mine. I sat down quietly, smoothing my dress, trying to be invisible in the best way. That's when Samantha appeared, her heels clicking like a ticking clock. Her face was pale, her lips tight. "Why are you sitting there?" she hissed. I blinked, confused. "I thought this was the groom's mother's seat," I said softly. Her eyes flashed, and before I could finish my sentence, her hand came across my face with a sound so sharp it silenced the laughter, the chatter, even the music. For a moment, no one moved. My cheek burned, and the world seemed to tilt. Elaine's voice broke the silence, a short, cruel laugh that cut deeper than the slap. "Well," she said loudly, "I suppose now she knows where she belongs." Robert chuckled beside her, raising his champagne glass. Around us, cell phones rose like tiny witnesses. Someone whispered, "Record this." I looked at Michael. My son. He stood just a few feet away, eyes wide frozen. I waited for him to step forward to say something, anything. But he didn't. The longer he stood there, the colder I felt. The crowd began to murmur, and I could hear the clicking of cameras, the quiet gasps, the embarrassed coughs. I wanted the earth to open and swallow me whole. Samantha turned away, first smoothing her hair like nothing had happened. The photographer hesitated. Camera still raised. Elaine gestured toward the stage. "Play the music," she ordered, smiling like a queen who had restored order. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling but my chin steady. My heart pounded in my ears. I could still feel the sting on my skin, but deeper than that, I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but fierce. I looked at Michael one last time, and when he finally met my eyes, I saw nothing there. Just confusion, fear, and shame. So I walked out, past the guests, past the whispers, past the laughter that had turned into a nervous hum. The sunlight outside was blinding, but I kept walking, my heels sinking into the grass, my breath uneven. That night, as I stood in front of my mirror, touching the fading red mark on my cheek, I heard the echo of that single, humiliating sound. The slap wasn't just a noise, it was a door closing the final punctuation at the end of 30 years of silence. That one sound, the slap, ended 30 years of my silence. It echoed inside me for days, long after the bruising on my cheek had faded. I could still feel it when I washed my face, when I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, when the quiet of my house felt heavier than usual. I hadn't realized before how much my life had revolved around being Michael's mother, how much of my own voice had gone missing in the process. That night, after the wedding, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold, trying to understand how kindness could be mistaken for weakness, and how love could turn into something that hurt this much. When you raise a child alone, your world narrows. Mine began to shrink the day my husband died. We were in our early 40s then. He had a heart attack in his classroom. One minute he was writing on the chalkboard, and the next he was gone. I remember the principal calling me at work, the sound of her voice shaking. I didn't cry right away. I remember washing the dishes that night, stacking them carefully, like keeping order would hold the world together. Michael was 12, sitting on the couch with his backpack still on. He looked small and lost. I promised him we'd be okay, even though I had no idea how. I kept that promise the only way I knew how, by working. I taught full-time at the high school during the day and tutored kids in the evenings. I graded papers until midnight, the lamp casting a tired yellow glow across the table. On weekends, I took on extra classes at the community center, writing workshops for adults trying to get their GEDs. I never told Michael when I came home too tired to eat or when the bills scared me. I didn't want him to feel guilty. I just wanted him to have a normal childhood, one that didn't smell of fear or cheap instant coffee. A few years later, my parents passed away within months of each other. They left behind a small piece of land outside of town, 5 acres of memories, really, with an old barn and a house that leaned to one side. I sold it, though it broke my heart to do it. The realtor said I could have gotten more if I waited, but I needed the money to buy a house for Michael and me. I wanted him to have stability, a home with roots. I remember the day we moved in, a modest 2-story with peeling paint and a creaky porch swing. Michael ran through the halls shouting, "This is ours, Mom!" I laughed then. It felt worth it. Every drop of sweat, every lost night's sleep, worth it. As he grew older, I kept telling myself that love meant staying quiet, that if I stayed calm, patient, and agreeable, people would respect me. It's what my own mother taught me. Don't raise your voice, Helen. People listen better when you whisper. So I whispered through everything, through loneliness, through exhaustion, through all the little ways life reminded me that women like me were supposed to endure. I believed if I gave enough time, money, patience, life would be kind in return. Michael was a good boy, smart and curious, but as he got older, I noticed how easily he gravitated towards stronger voices. Teachers, coaches, even girlfriends. He wanted to please them, to be liked. It's a trait he got from me, I suppose. When he left for college, I hugged him longer than he liked. "You'll never be alone, Mom," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. I held on to that sentence for years. It became my anchor. Every time I felt tired or invisible, I reminded myself that I had raised a son who would always be there. That was my reward. After his father's death, I kept a small box in the top drawer of my dresser, our life in paper form. The mortgage deed, the insurance letters, the photo of our first Christmas tree in that little house. I'd look at it sometimes when the house felt too quiet, reminding myself that I had built something solid from nothing. But somewhere along the way, that pride turned into dependence. I didn't notice it happening. You never do when the people you love slowly become your reason for existing. The night after the wedding, as I sat by the window with the curtains half drawn, I thought about every sacrifice I'd made, how each one had seemed small at the time. Selling the land, taking extra shifts, skipping new clothes so Michael could have a better car. Each choice felt right, even noble when it was for him. But looking back, I couldn't remember the last thing I had done just for myself. Not one. Outside, the streetlights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, laughter floated from another house, someone else's celebration. I traced my fingers over the edge of the old family photo still pinned to the fridge. My husband's face smiled back, steady and calm. I wondered what he would say if he'd been at that wedding, if he'd seen what our love had turned into. Maybe he'd say I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe he'd remind me that silence is not the same as grace. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a faint yellow shadow, but the ache underneath it stayed. It wasn't just the slap that hurt. It was the realization that I had taught everyone, even my own son, how to treat me. By always being quiet, I had made it easy for people to forget that I had a voice at all. I thought love meant giving everything. I didn't realize how much I'd given up. That truth followed me into the days after the wedding, sitting heavy in the corners of my house like dust I couldn't sweep away. For a while, I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. I cleaned folded laundry and made tea I never drank. But every time I walked past a mirror, I caught a glimpse of that faint yellow mark on my cheek, and it reminded me of the silence in the room after the slap, the way people had looked at me as if I were something pitiful, something worth recording, but not defending. It started 2 mornings later. My neighbor, Mrs. Blake, knocked on my door holding her phone. "Helen," she said softly, "I think you should see this." I didn't want to, but she turned the screen toward me before I could refuse. There it was, the wedding scene frozen mid-motion. My hand half raised, my face turned in shock. Someone had added text over the video. "Mother-in-law slapped at wedding drama." The clip played for only 8 seconds, but that was all it took. It had already been shared thousands of times on TikTok and Facebook. The comments were worse than the slap itself. She probably deserved it. "Entitled males always ruin weddings. The mom looks crazy." I stared until the words blurred, until Mrs. Blake gently took her phone back and said, "Don't look at it anymore, honey. Just don't." By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications piled in like waves I couldn't control. Some were from people I knew asking if it was really me. Others were strangers calling me names I didn't have the heart to read out loud. Reporters from local gossip pages sent messages asking for my side of the story. I wanted to defend myself, to explain, but I remembered something my husband once told me. Once you start fighting a rumor, you've already lost. So instead, I called Mr. Dwyer, the lawyer who had handled my husband's will years ago. He listened quietly as I explained, his voice steady as always. "Helen," he said, "don't engage. The internet will move on, but if you respond, they'll never let it go. Turn off your phone, stay quiet for a few days. We'll handle anything that matters in person." So I did. I turned off my phone and tucked it in a drawer. For 3 days, I let the world spin without me. I read old books, watered my plants, and tried not to think about how easily a lifetime of dignity could be undone by a single video. It felt strange being invisible by choice for once. I thought about how much of my life I had spent staying quiet, trying to be small. This time, the quiet wasn't a choice, it was survival. When I finally turned my phone back on, it was as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The calls had stopped. The comments slowed, but the silence felt heavier now, like people were talking about me behind closed doors instead of online. I decided to walk to the mailbox, needing something ordinary to hold on to. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes you notice how empty your hands feel. There were only a few envelopes, junk mail, a grocery ad, and one letter from the county clerk's office. I assumed it was another formality about property taxes, something dull and predictable. Inside, though, was a notice that made my knees weaken. It said my name had been removed from the deed of my own house. The document claimed I had authorized a transfer of ownership to Michael Whitmore and Robert Pierce as co. owners. My signature was there at the bottom, neat and careful and completely forged. I sat on the front step for a long time, reading the letter again and again, my hands trembling. I could hear birds somewhere above me, the world still moving while mine had stopped. When I called the county office, the clerk's voice was polite but detached. "It's listed as pending," she said, "meaning the transfer is awaiting verification. The property hasn't been sold yet, ma'am, but it's under review." Pending. The word echoed in my head like a warning bell. Pending fraud. Pending theft. Pending the next thing they'd take from me. That night I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. Everything I had worked for, every dollar, every hour of sleep lost, was in this place. I thought of Michael as a boy running down these halls in socks too big for his feet. I thought of my husband fixing the porch swing. All the love and labor poured into this home, and now it sat on paper as if it could belong to someone else. The bruise on my face had faded completely by then, but something deeper had begun to form a cold, steady anger that felt nothing like shame. They had already stripped away my pride, but now they were reaching for the only thing left that grounded me. As I folded the letter and placed it on the table, I knew this wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was war, quiet and deliberate. They hadn't just taken my pride, they were planning to take my home. That thought kept circling my mind like a restless bird that refused to land. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house sounded like a warning. I made tea at 3 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table, the county notice spread before me, reading it until the words blurred. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait for someone else to decide what belonged to me. The county recorder's office was quieter than I expected. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and the sound of a printer hummed from behind the counter. A young clerk in a blue shirt looked up when I walked in, his polite smile fading slightly when he saw the strain on my face. "I need to look at my property records," I said. My voice came out steady, more steady than I felt. He nodded and led me to a small desk with an aging computer. He typed my address into the system, then frowned. "There's been a recent filing," he said. My stomach tightened. "Can I see it?" He hesitated, then printed a few pages and handed them over. The top page read, "Power of Attorney," dated 2 months earlier. My name was signed at the bottom in a careful, practiced hand. My hand, except it wasn't. I traced the signature with my finger. Every loop, every line looked almost right, but there was something mechanical about it, as if someone had studied my writing and copied it from memory. I felt a chill spread through my chest. "Where did this come from?" I asked. The clerk shook his head. "It was filed by Robert Pierce," he said quietly. He submitted the supporting documents as the executor of a joint property arrangement. He looked uncomfortable, as if he already knew what this meant, but couldn't say it aloud. I thanked him, though the words barely left my lips, and walked out into the cold air. The papers trembled in my hands as I called Mr. Dwyer's office. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm as ever. "Helen, what's wrong?" he asked. I told him everything: the forged signature, the filing, Robert's name. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Then he said, "I want you to come here. Right now." Dwyer's office looked the same as it had years ago, stacks of files, the smell of old wood and lemon polish. He adjusted his glasses and studied the document, his expression darkening. "This is bad," he said softly. "They're using a forged power of attorney to claim joint ownership. But they've moved too quickly. The sale hasn't been finalized yet." He opened a drawer and pulled out a blank form. "We'll file a lis pendens today. It's a public notice that there's a lawsuit pending. It freezes the property. No one can sell, transfer, or borrow against it until this is resolved." I watched as he filled in the lines with careful precision. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like air returning to my lungs. "So they can't sell it?" I asked. "Not once this is filed," he said. "They'll know we're on to them, but the court will see the documents. It'll buy us time." I nodded, my hands clasped tight in my lap. "What should I do now?" I asked. Dwyer looked at me, his eyes kind but serious. "Document everything. Every letter, every call, every interaction. Keep copies, notes, dates. Don't confront them directly. Let the evidence speak." He paused, then added, And Helen, don't underestimate them. People like that don't stop until they're made to. When I left his office, the sun was setting over the courthouse, painting long shadows across the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, clutching the stamped copy of the Lispendens notice in my hand. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something solid proof that I wasn't powerless. That night, I opened a new notebook at my kitchen table and began writing. Dates, names, conversations, even memories that felt connected somehow. I taped the forged document to the first page and labeled it evidence. The house felt different now, not like a refuge, but a battlefield. Still, it was mine. I wasn't ready to give up the ground I'd built with my own hands. As I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, I realized something had changed. I wasn't the same woman who stood frozen at that wedding waiting for someone else to defend her. I might not have known how to play their game before, but now I had a rule book and a will to use it. If this was a game, I'd just learned their rules. Once I understood that my fear began to shift into something else, something colder, steadier. I stopped shaking every time the phone rang. I started to look at people differently, listening for what wasn't being said. The silence around me no longer felt like weakness. It felt like preparation. I had spent a lifetime waiting for the right moment to speak. Now I was waiting for the right moment to act. The first step was finding out what really happened at that wedding. The slap had felt spontaneous, but the more I thought about it, the more rehearsed it seemed. Elaine's smirk, Robert's laughter, the conveniently positioned cameras, none of it felt accidental. If there was a plan behind it, there had to be proof. I called Linda one afternoon and told her everything that had happened since the courthouse filing. Her voice, warm and steady, was the one sound that made me feel less alone. "They played Dirty Helen," she said. "So now you play smart. Start with that video, the one online I asked. It's edited, cut short." "Exactly," she said. Someone wanted it that way. Linda's nephew, Andrew, was good with computers. He volunteered at the library, fixing old laptops and helping seniors recover passwords. I'd met him once, a quiet boy with sharp eyes and a nervous smile. When Linda told him what happened, he agreed to help. A few days later, he showed up at my door with his tablet and a shy nod. "Ms. Whitmore, I think I might have found something." He explained that the viral wedding clip had been uploaded by a local videographer named Jack Peters. His name had appeared briefly in a forum post about camera equipment. "He's not active online anymore," Andrew said, tapping at the screen, "but he used the same username on a photography site. I think I can reach him." We sent a polite message asking to speak about the footage. No response. Another message followed a few days later this time, from Linda's account with her usual charm. "We're not angry, Jack. We just want to make things right." That did the trick. He replied within an hour, asking to meet somewhere private. When we arrived at the coffee shop, he was already there, a young man in his mid-20s, pale and jumpy, his hands fidgeting around a paper cup. He recognized me instantly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know you'd come yourself." I smiled faintly. "You were at my son's wedding, weren't you?" He nodded, his shoulders tense. "Yeah. I was hired by Elaine Pierce. She paid me up front and told me to delete all raw footage after delivery. It wasn't unusual. Some clients want privacy, but..." He hesitated, glancing at Linda as if asking for permission to keep going. But something about it bothered me. The way she said it. She wanted everything deleted immediately after the edited version went out. No backups, no copies. Just gone. I leaned forward. "Did you delete them?" He swallowed hard. "Not exactly. I have this habit of syncing everything to my personal cloud as a backup. I forgot it was still active until a few weeks ago. When that video started spreading online, I checked and realized what I had. The full recording. Everything. Even the minutes before and after the slap. I could hear my pulse in my ears. You still have it? He nodded. Yes. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want trouble, but my conscience wouldn't let me sleep. Linda reached across the table and touched his arm gently. Then help her, she said. Jack sighed, opened his laptop, and turned the screen toward us. I'm sending you a link. The file's large, but it's yours. I watched as he typed quickly, then pressed enter. It'll be in your email in a few minutes, he said. His voice shook a little, but his eyes were steady. Just be careful. That woman's not someone you want as an enemy. I thanked him quietly. As we walked out of the cafe, the late afternoon light slanted across the pavement, golden and cold. Linda slipped her arm through mine. What do you think's on it? She asked. I stared ahead, already feeling the weight of what I was about to uncover. The truth, I said softly. And the truth always leaves a mark. That night, I sat at my desk staring at my laptop as the file downloaded hourglass, spinning seconds dragging. The air in the house felt charged, like the moment before a storm. When the download finally completed, I took a deep breath and clicked play. The video began, and for the first time since that awful day, I saw what everyone else had missed. They wanted a show. I'd give them one, just not the kind they expected. I remember thinking that as I printed out every piece of evidence Jack had given me, labeling each file neatly into folders, my teacher's habit of order becoming my armor. For a while, that quiet focus was enough to steady me. But even as I built my case, another war was unfolding one. I couldn't see one being waged in whispers and falsehoods. It wasn't fought in courtrooms or with papers. It was fought with love twisted into something unrecognizable. It began with small changes. Michael stopped calling as often. When he did, his voice carried an edge of hesitation, like he was measuring every word. Mom, are you doing okay? He asked one afternoon, his tone too careful. I'm managing, I said, trying to sound lighter than I felt. I've been working with Mr. Dwyer. He says we're making progress. There was a pause. You should probably rest more, he murmured. You've been under a lot of stress. I just worry sometimes. It was such a simple statement, but something about it felt off, rehearsed even. Worry about what I wanted to ask. But instead, I just said thank you because that's what mothers do. We take concern where we can get it, even when it feels foreign. 2 days later, Linda called. Helen, she said cautiously. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Michael came by the school to drop something off. Samantha was with him. She didn't say much, but I overheard her telling someone that you've been unstable. My heart sank. Unstable. Linda hesitated. Something about you sending strange messages, about you threatening. She stopped herself, but I could hear the rest in her silence. I sat at the table, the phone pressed against my ear, my breath coming slow and shallow. She said, I threatened myself, I whispered. I don't believe a word of it, Linda said quickly. But Helen, if that's what they're spreading, it's serious. You need to protect yourself. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called Michael, needing to hear his voice, needing to understand. He answered on the third ring. Mom, he said, sounding weary. Can we not do this right now? Do what I asked, forcing calm into my voice. This, he sighed. Samantha showed me the messages. You texted me last week saying you didn't want to live like this anymore, that everything was my fault. My mind froze. Michael, I didn't write those. They came from your number, he said softly, almost apologetically. She showed me. I don't know what's happening, but Please just get help, okay? I'm doing what I can. I gripped the phone so tightly, my hand hurt. Michael, listen to me. I never sent those messages. Someone spoofed my number or used a fake app. I would never. Mom, he interrupted, his voice breaking just a little. Please, I'm not angry. I just want you to be safe. When he hung up, I sat there staring at the silent phone, feeling something inside me crumble. The ache wasn't just from being doubted. It was from realizing that someone I loved had been turned into a weapon against me. Samantha's cruelty was deliberate, precise. She wasn't just trying to win Michael's loyalty, she was trying to rewrite my identity. To the world, I was now unstable. To my son, I was fragile. The following week, I noticed new patterns. Samantha answered Michael's phone when I called. She filtered what he heard about the case about me. When she did speak to me, her words were sugar-coated poison. Helen, she'd say with feigned concern, "You really should take a break from all this legal stuff. Michael worries you're fixating. We just want you to be happy." Every time she said we, it felt like a door closing. But I didn't argue. I'd learned that anger only fed her performance. Instead, I turned inward. I collected every bank transfer that passed through Robert's accounts, every email that looked altered, every phone record Dwyer could subpoena. At night, when the loneliness grew heavy, I reread my notes and told myself that truth didn't need volume, it just needed persistence. Once, I almost broke. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I saw Michael's car parked across town while I was running errands. I slowed, thinking maybe I could talk to him face to face, cut through the fog that Samantha had built. But when I saw her step out of the passenger seat, laughing, her hand on his arm, I kept driving. He looked tired, older, weighed down. And I realized then that my son wasn't cruel, he was lost. She had made him believe that protecting me meant staying away. That night, I sat by the window, the house quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. The anger I'd felt before had softened into something deeper resolve. They could twist his perception, flood his phone with lies, fill the world with gossip, but the truth was still mine to hold. They couldn't fake the documents I'd kept or erase the evidence I'd found. I looked around my dimly lit living room at the stacks of folders and files spread across the table like armor. I thought about the years I'd spent teaching children to look for answers, to keep faith in their own reasoning, even when others told them they were wrong. It struck me that I was still teaching, only now the lesson was my own, that truth, no matter how buried, has a way of surviving. I wiped my tears, closed my notebook, and whispered to the empty room, as if the walls themselves needed reminding. They had his ears, but I still had the truth. The thought kept echoing in my mind as I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, a cup of cold tea untouched beside me. Days had begun to stretch into one another, each one feeling heavier than the last. My son barely spoke to me anymore, and when he did, there was a distance in his voice I didn't recognize. I could almost hear Samantha behind every word, whispering, shaping his thoughts. The loneliness was sharper now, not because I was alone, but because the people I loved most were near and unreachable. The house, once a comfort, had become too quiet. I tried to keep busy, sorting through receipts, rereading Dwyer's notes, collecting copies of the bank statements, but it all felt mechanical. Every action reminded me of how far I'd fallen from the life I once had. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there was still a flicker of something that refused to die, some small, stubborn piece of me that wanted to stand back up. It was Linda who pulled that piece of me back into the light. She called one morning, her voice as brisk as always, though I could hear the concern tucked underneath. "I've been hearing about your case," she said. "Come see me." "Linda, you're not well enough." "I'm well enough to sit and talk," she interrupted. "And you sound like a woman sitting in her own shadow." "Get in the car, Helen." I have coffee, and I'm tired of hearing myself think. I laughed despite myself. That was Linda Sharp. No nonsense, and somehow still finding ways to make me feel 12 years younger. By noon, I was pulling into the nursing home's small parking lot, a modest building with flower beds that needed trimming and windows that looked out over the hills. She was waiting in this common room, her wheelchair turned toward the window, a blanket draped neatly over her legs. When she saw me, her face broke into that familiar grin. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," I replied dryly, and we both laughed, the sound cutting through the air like something alive. For a while, we talked about nothing, how bland the food was, how the staff were sweet but overworked, how time seemed to move differently in a place like this. But eventually the conversation shifted. She looked at me, her expression softening. "You know I saw that video," she said quietly. I tensed, embarrassed, but she raised a hand. "Don't. You handled it better than most people would have." I would have thrown the cake. "Linda." I sighed, shaking my head, but she smiled. Then her tone changed, her words slower, deliberate. "Helen, I've known you most of my life. You've always been the quiet one. You think before you speak, you wait before you act. It's what made you a good teacher and a better mother. But let me tell you something. No one remembers who stayed quiet." The words landed like a stone in my chest. I looked at her, unsure what to say. She continued. "You think silence keeps the peace, but all it does is make room for people like Elaine to fill it with their noise. You've spent your whole life being polite. Maybe it's time you stop mistaking silence for grace." I blinked back tears. I wouldn't even know where to start. "You start by believing your story matters," she said. "You have the truth, Helen. You have the papers, the signatures, the proof. Don't let them bury you under lies." That night, her words wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I returned to the nursing home this time with 2 boxes of documents from my house. Linda's eyes lit up when she saw them. "Good," she said, clapping her hands together. "Let's make some noise." We spread everything out on the small table in her room. Bank, transfers, deed copies, screenshots of messages, even the old emails between Robert and the broker. She handed me a notebook. "Write everything down, every date, every detail. You taught children to organize chaos, didn't you? Apply that here." For hours we worked together. She dictated while I organized. Occasionally, she'd lean back thinking. "You see this," she said, pointing to one line on the property document. "That's where they slipped it in the clause about power of attorney. Clever, but sloppy." I felt a strange spark of energy building in me, the same kind I used to feel in the classroom when a student finally understood something difficult. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming control, about not letting myself be defined by humiliation or pity. By the time I left that evening, we had a binder thick with notes and copies. Linda grinned, her eyes tired but triumphant. "You see, you're not helpless. You never were. You just needed someone to remind you of the sound of your own voice." On the drive home, I replayed that line again and again. The sunset stretched long across the sky, painting everything gold, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of dread in my chest. Instead, I felt something rising steady, quiet, unstoppable. That night, I stood in my living room surrounded by papers and promises. For the first time, I saw not chaos, but clarity. I picked up my phone, called Dwyer, and said, "I'm ready. Let's fight." When I hung up, the house was silent. But it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the calm before a storm I was finally willing to face. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being loud. That realization followed me out of Linda's nursing home like a quiet vow. The next morning I woke, Before dawn, brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, receipts, and letters that told the story of my life in paper form. I had always thought of myself as a teacher, a mother, a widow. But that morning, I felt something different rising in me. I was a fighter, though my weapons were documents and patience instead of fists. Dwyer came by mid-morning, his suit pressed and his expression calm but focused. "It's time," he said simply, placing a stack of legal papers on the table. I watched as he filled in the final signatures, my name appearing again and again in sharp black ink. It struck me how something as small as a pen stroke could reclaim the space where my voice had been missing. When it was done, he looked up at me. "This starts the process. We'll file the civil suit today. The court will issue a temporary possession order, so you'll stay here until it's settled. You won't be forced out again." I nodded, exhaling the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For months, I had lived with the quiet terror that one morning I might wake up to find my locks changed and strangers in my living room. Knowing that couldn't happen, not yet, felt like a small victory. After he left, I walked through each room, slowly touching the edges of the furniture, running my hand along the cool wall of the hallway. The house had felt like a battlefield for so long, but now it felt like a promise. A week later, Dwyer called with news. Robert tried to sell the house, he said, his tone almost amused. He listed it through a broker under a shell company, hoping no one would notice. But our Lis Pendon's notice blocked it. The title is frozen until the case is resolved. I smiled for the first time in days. So he can't sell it. Not a chance. The moment the buyer's lawyer checked the records, the deal fell through. He'll have to face this in court. The image of Robert slamming down his phone or pacing his office gave me more satisfaction than I cared to admit. But the small sense of triumph didn't last long. People like Elaine and Robert didn't give up. They retaliated in quieter, crueler ways. A few days later, Linda called, her voice trembling with anger. "Helen, have you seen what's on Facebook?" "I don't use Facebook much," I said. "What is it?" "It's a post on that local gossip group, Fairview Happenings." Elaine's been running her mouth again. I pulled out my laptop, my hands already shaking before the screen lit up. The post was right there at the top of the feed, her name bold and unmistakable. "Some people don't know when to step aside gracefully. It's sad watching someone decline and refuse help. Mental illness is a tragedy, but denial is worse." The comments came in waves. Some sympathetic, others cruel. "Oh, poor thing. I heard she's losing it." "Isn't that the lady from the wedding video?" I sat there staring at the words until they blurred. The anger was sharp, but beneath it was something heavier, a grief for the world I thought I knew. I had been a teacher for decades. My neighbors had waved to me from their porches. Now those same faces might look at me and wonder if I was declining. It was a new kind of humiliation, public and invisible all at once. Dwyer told me not to respond. "Every word you say online can be twisted," he warned. "Let her talk. We'll prove the truth in court." So I did nothing. I stayed quiet. But this silence felt different from the kind I used to hide behind. It wasn't submission, it was strategy. Every day I kept notes, dates, screenshots, every small detail that showed how far they were willing to go. I wasn't waiting in fear anymore. I was preparing. The months dragged on. Court dates were postponed, filings, delayed hearings rescheduled. What had begun as a single lawsuit stretched into a long winter of waiting. The world moved forward, but my life was paused in a loop of paperwork and patience. There were days when I wanted to scream to demand that justice hurry up, but I didn't. I learned that endurance has a rhythm, that some battles aren't won with speed, but with stillness. Linda visited often. We would sit at the kitchen table drinking tea and marking the weeks on the calendar. "You're stronger than you think," she told me once. "You used to be afraid of making noise. Now your silence is loud enough to shake them." Her words stayed with me. The longer the case went on, the less power their gossip seemed to hold. My neighbors still whispered, but they also watched. And slowly, the sympathy began to shift. The woman who had been painted as unstable was still standing still, living in her house, still walking down to the corner store every morning with her head high. I didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. My persistence spoke for me. 9 months after the lawsuit began, Dwyer called to tell me the final hearing was being scheduled. "It's almost over," he said. "They're cornered. You just need to hold steady a little longer." That night I walked out to the garden. The flowers were beginning to bloom again, stubborn as ever, pushing through the cold ground. I knelt and touched the soil, feeling the damp earth between my fingers. Waiting had changed me. It had stripped away my fear, my hesitation, even my need for approval. I realized that silence could be a weapon, or a wound depending on who wielded it. And I wasn't afraid to use it anymore. 9 months of waiting had taught me one thing. Silence was never my safety. But silence also became the air I breathed. The court hearings dragged on, the lawyers exchanged paperwork, and days blurred into one another. I had grown used to the rhythm of quiet endurance, wake up, gather documents, water the garden, and wait for something to change. Dwyer told me to be patient, that justice had its own pace. Patience, I learned, was a kind of discipline, but it was also a kind of loneliness. Michael still hadn't called. The last message from him had been a short text months ago asking if I needed anything from the hardware store. I told him I was fine. I wasn't, but pride kept my fingers from typing the truth. I missed him terribly, but every time I pictured his face, it was the same expression he'd worn at the wedding, shocked, uncertain, standing behind Samantha as she raised her hand against me. That image had faded into my mind like a scar, permanent, but dulled. I thought I'd learned to live with it until the afternoon Linda called. Her voice trembled with excitement. "Helen, you'd better come over. Andrew found something you need to hear it yourself." I didn't ask questions. Within the hour I was at her apartment, the familiar scent of her lavender hand cream filling the air. Andrew was already waiting, his laptop open on the coffee table. He gave me a nervous smile, like a boy about to reveal a secret he wasn't sure should be told. "I was reviewing the files from Jack's cloud backup," he said. "There were dozens of small clips, mostly random test footage. But then I found this." He pressed play. At first, all I heard was static, then voices. Elaine's voice, sharp and steady, the kind that cuts through a crowd without raising volume. "He'll sign it," she said. "Just tell him it's a loan document. He won't read the fine print. He trusts you." Another voice, unmistakably Robert's, followed, and his mother. "Don't worry about her," Elaine replied coolly. "She'll be too busy pretending she still matters. By the time she realizes what happened, it'll be done." My breath caught. Then beneath the hum of background noise came a third voice, Michael's, my son's voice. Softer, hesitant, uncertain. "Are you sure this is legal?" he asked. "Mom doesn't like when I sign anything without her looking." Elaine laughed, the sound like glass breaking. "Michael, it's just loan paperwork. Don't overthink it. You're helping your family." The recording ended abruptly. The room fell silent. I stared at the laptop screen as if it might explain itself. My chest felt tight, my hands cold. "He was there," I whispered. "He was in the room." Linda reached over, placing her hand on mine. "Helen, wait." He sounded confused. "You heard him." He didn't understand what he was signing, but my heart didn't care about reason. All I could think was that my son had been part of it, however small. The betrayal I had tried not to imagine was suddenly real, recorded, undeniable. My throat burned with the kind of hurt that has no words. "He was supposed to protect me," I said quietly. "I raised him to do the right thing. How could he sit there while they plotted against me?" Linda said nothing. She didn't have to. Some griefs have no answer. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed the recording again and again until the words became blurred noise. I wanted to hate him, to let the anger fill the space where love had lived, but I couldn't. Even through the fury, I could hear the fear in his voice. The way he hesitated before speaking. The way he asked if it was legal. My son wasn't cruel. He was gullible. And Elaine had always known how to use good people for her gain. The next morning, I took the recording to Dwyer. His expression didn't change as he listened, but his fingers tightened slightly on his pen. When it ended, he leaned back and said, "Helen, your son didn't betray you. He was tricked. That signature on the transfer documents, it matches the one in this recording's time frame. I'll bet you anything Elaine and Robert told him he was signing something temporary, a refinancing or loan. We'll prove it." He spent the next week digging through financial records and email archives. When he finally called me back to his office, there was a light in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "You were right," he said. "Your son signed under false pretenses." The form he signed was a loan document that had a hidden clause transferring property interest to Robert. Michael never saw it. They buried it in the fine print. It's fraud, plain and simple. I felt my knees weaken. Relief and sorrow washed over me all at once. He didn't know I whispered. He thought he was helping. Dwyer nodded. "And now we can prove it. The court will see the manipulation for what it was." When I got home, I sat by the window watching the light fade over the yard. The garden was quiet, except for the sound of the wind brushing against the leaves. I thought about all the ways silence had shaped my life, how I'd let it protect me, how it had protected no one. I realized that I wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. I was fighting for my son's name, for the boy who once promised, "You'll never be alone, Mom," and for the man who had lost his way trying to keep that promise. For the first time since this began, I felt a new kind of resolve, not sharp or angry, but steady, grounded in love rather than vengeance. I knew what Elaine had done, and I knew how to expose it. But more than that, I knew what I wanted the end of this fight to mean, not punishment, but truth. Maybe my enemy wasn't my son, but his silence. I held on to that realization like a fragile truth, something that could break if I examined it too closely. The days leading up to the hearing blurred together. I hardly slept rehearsing questions in my mind, running through every possible argument they could throw at me. I wasn't afraid of losing the case anymore, not the way I had been before. What I feared most was being misunderstood, turned into a caricature of myself by Elaine's words. She was good at that, twisting facts into weapons. But I wasn't the same woman she'd humiliated at that wedding. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. My hands trembled slightly as I pinned my hair up, but my reflection looked calm. Dwyer had told me to dress simply, like the teacher you've always been, he'd said. I chose a navy skirt and a cream blouse pressed crisp, modest, but steady. I wanted to look like someone who belonged there, someone who deserved to be heard. Linda insisted on coming with me. "You'll need moral support," she'd said over the phone, "and I make a mean muffin." I smiled, not understanding what she meant, until that morning when she appeared at my door carrying a small basket wrapped in a checkered cloth. The smell of blueberries filled the car as we drove. "For luck," she said, her eyes twinkling. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavy, the kind that threatens rain, but never quite delivers. We found a bench just outside the courtroom doors. My palms were damp, my heartbeat a steady drum in my ears. Linda reached into the basket and handed me a muffin. "You know," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "our weapons are baked, not loaded." I couldn't help it, I laughed. "If laughter's evidence," I whispered back, "we're doomed." A passing bailiff shot us a curious look, and Linda straightened her posture like a schoolgirl caught whispering in class. "Don't worry, officer," she said sweetly. "We're harmless." His brow furrowed before he moved on, and we both stifled another laugh. For a moment the tension broke, replaced by something small but necessary lightness. When they finally called my name, the laughter faded. I followed Dwyer into the courtroom, the echo of my footsteps mixing with the hum of whispered conversation. Elaine sat at the plaintiff's table beside her lawyer, dressed in pale gray, every hair perfectly in place. Robert leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression smug. And there, 2 rows behind them, was Michael. My breath caught when I saw him. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the floor. I took my seat, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The judge entered, and the room settled into quiet anticipation. Elaine's lawyer, a thin man with a slick voice, began his opening statement. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this case centers on a tragic situation. A once competent woman whose mental decline has led to confusion and irrational behavior. Mrs. Whitmore, while undoubtedly once a respected member of the community, is no longer capable of managing her affairs responsibly." I felt the words like small cuts against my skin. I wanted to stand and shout that it was all lies, but I stayed still. "Dwyer had warned me they'll bait you, don't give them the satisfaction." The lawyer continued, presenting a stack of printed emails and text messages, fabricated evidence no doubt. "Here," he said, "is communication in which Mrs. Whitmore admits to losing control and apologizes for false accusations against my clients." He laid them on the table with theatrical precision. Dwyer rose calmly. "Your Honor, we object to the admission of these documents until we can verify their authenticity," he said. "In fact, we request a brief adjournment to review the digital metadata associated with these files." The judge looked up, studying Dwyer. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that forgery and manipulation of digital records have been established." "Patterns in this case," Dwyer replied evenly. "We have reason to believe these documents were not generated by Mrs. Whitmore." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elaine's lawyer tried to hide his irritation. "This is a stalling tactic," he protested. But Dwyer stood firm. "It's a protection of the truth." The judge nodded slowly. "Adjournment granted. Court will reconvene after the technical review." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The room exhaled as people began to move. Elaine turned slightly in her chair, just enough for me to see the smirk on her face. It was the same one she'd worn at the wedding, the look of a woman convinced she'd already won. I gathered my papers, standing slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Inside, though, I felt something shift again, not fear this time, but focus. Let her smirk. Let her believe this was over. She didn't know about the one thing I hadn't shown anyone yet, the last piece of proof I'd been saving for when it mattered most. They thought I was finished. They didn't know what I'd kept hidden. But even strength has limits, and in the weeks that followed the adjournment, I began to learn how cunning desperation can be when it's cornered. Elaine had built her life on control, every event, every perception, every lie carefully staged. The moment she realized her confidence was cracking, she doubled down. What came next was not an argument in court, but a war outside it. It started quietly, the way most things do. One morning, I received a letter in the mail, stamped with an unfamiliar clinic logo. It looked official, but something about it immediately felt wrong. The paper too glossy, the language too clinical, too certain. After psychological evaluation, it read, Mrs. Helen Whitmore exhibits signs of mental decline consistent with early cognitive impairment. It is the recommendation of this office that she be placed under supervised care for her own safety. At the bottom was a signature from a doctor I'd never met. I sat there for a long time staring at the words. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. The court had delayed the case, and now suddenly Elaine had medical evidence to support her narrative. I called Dwyer right away. He listened as I read the letter out loud, his voice tightening with each sentence. "It's fabricated," he said flatly. "That clinic doesn't exist in the state registry. She's trying to poison the well before trial resumes." A heaviness settled over me. Can she do that? Just make things up? She can, he said. But we can prove it's false. Don't respond to anything directly. Let me handle it. I hung up, but the reassurance didn't hold. Every time I thought I had reached the bottom of her cruelty, she dug deeper. Still, I tried to carry on. I went for my morning walks, made tea, kept my documents in order. I told myself it was all temporary, that truth would outlast manipulation. But then, one phone call changed everything. It came on a Tuesday evening. The sun was low, turning the kitchen golden when the phone rang. It was the nursing home. Linda had been in an accident. My knees nearly gave out when I heard the words, "car crash." The nurse explained that Linda had been crossing the parking lot after physical therapy when a car sped through the entrance, clipping her from behind and sending her to the ground. "She's stable," the nurse said quickly, but shaken. "We're keeping her overnight for observation." I was at the hospital within the hour. Linda was bruised, her arm in a sling, but alive. When I saw her, relief and anger collided in my chest. "They said the driver didn't stop," she said, weakly wincing as she shifted in bed. "Just drove off." "Do they know who it was?" She shook her head. "Security cameras caught part of the license plate, but it's blurry. They think it might be a rental." A rental. The word stuck in my mind. Robert Pierce worked in real estate. Rentals were his language. The thought twisted my stomach. "You think it was them?" Linda said, quietly reading my face. I didn't answer, but we both knew. There was no proof, none yet, but it fit too neatly into the pattern. Elaine couldn't silence me in court, so she was trying to shake me outside of it. By the time I got home that night, exhaustion settled into my bones. I sat in the dark living room, the glow of the porch light seeping faintly through the window. The files on my desk blurred into a mess of paper and ink. For the first time since the wedding, I felt truly defeated. The idea of withdrawing the case crossed my mind, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of me. Maybe that was their goal all along. I reached for my phone to call Dwyer, ready to say I wanted to stop, when a new email notification appeared. It was from Jack Peters, the videographer. The subject line read, "You should see this." My pulse quickened as I opened it. Inside was a short message. I was going through the raw video again, trying to clean up the resolution for court. I found something odd in the file's data. "I think it's important." Attached was a screenshot, lines of metadata code timestamps, and an IP address highlighted in yellow. "This file's original upload came from an event planner's server," his note continued. "You might want to tell your lawyer." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Elaine owned an event planning business. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear. I felt purpose again, sharp and alive. Whatever she had buried, she'd buried it in her own backyard. The fake doctor's report, the smear campaign, the attack on Linda, it had all been a distraction. A desperate attempt to keep my eyes away from the one thing that could unravel her lies completely. The truth wasn't lost. It was hidden in the smallest details, the kind people like Elaine never bothered to check because they believed no one beneath them would ever look closely enough. They buried the truth in pixels. I was about to dig it out. When I woke the next morning, I felt something I hadn't in months, a kind of clear calm, like the quiet that comes after a long storm. Jack's email was still open on my laptop, the metadata screenshot glowing faintly on the screen. The lines of code meant nothing to me, but the yellow highlighted IP address meant everything. I called Dwyer before sunrise. He listened carefully, asked me to forward the file, and promised to meet at his office by noon. When I arrived, he was already there, his desk, covered in printed screenshots, phone records, and a small external hard drive. He looked up at me and said, "Helen, if this checks out, it's not just evidence, it's intent." That word intent hung in the air like something sacred. It meant this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a family dispute. It meant someone had set out to destroy me. For the first time, I felt like the law was finally catching up to the truth. Dwyer explained that the IP address linked directly to the network registered under Elaine's event planning business, Pierce Celebrations. The original upload timestamp matched the day after the wedding, less than 24 hours before the viral version appeared online. She didn't just orchestrate the humiliation, Dwyer said. She broadcast it. The court reconvened 2 weeks later. I arrived early, the same navy skirt pressed the same steady calm in my chest, but this time, the fear was gone. Linda was still recovering, so she couldn't attend, but she sent a note that I carried in my pocket. It read simply, "Don't whisper today. Speak." When I stepped into the courtroom, I could feel the change in the air. Elaine sat at her table, her poise as perfect as ever, though I caught a flicker of irritation when she saw me. Robert sat beside her, avoiding my eyes. Michael wasn't there. A small part of me ached for that, but another part was relieved. He didn't need to see this. The judge entered, and Dwyer rose. "Your Honor," he began, his tone steady but sharp. "The defense has new evidence that directly contradicts the plaintiff's claims of defamation and incompetence." He nodded toward the projection screen that had been set up near the bench. "This evidence concerns the origin of the video central to this case." Elaine's lawyer objected immediately, his voice rising. "Your Honor, this was not disclosed during discovery. It was uncovered only recently," Dwyer replied smoothly, handing the judge a folder. The metadata from the original file reveals the upload source as the plaintiff's own business server. The IP address, timestamp, and digital signature confirm that the file originated from within Mrs. Pierce's company network. We have verified this independently with the hosting provider. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the papers. Then with a nod, she gestured for Dwyer to continue. He clicked to the next slide, an enlarged image of the metadata file, the highlighted IP address glowing under the courtroom lights. This, he said clearly, is the digital fingerprint of deceit. The very people who claim to be victims of slander were the ones who authored it. I looked across the room at Elaine. For the first time since the wedding, her mask cracked. The color drained from her face, her lips tightening, as though holding back words she couldn't risk saying. I stood slowly. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it, but my voice came out clear. "You taught your daughter to humiliate me," I said softly. "Now the truth humiliates you." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. For a brief moment, Elaine's eyes met mine, and what I saw there wasn't anger, it was disbelief. She had built her entire identity on control, and for the first time, she had none. Her lawyer stammered something about technical errors and data misinterpretation, but it was useless. The judge raised her hand for silence. "The court will not tolerate falsified evidence or defamatory conduct," she said firmly. "The deed transfer is void. Property ownership is fully restored to Mrs. Helen Whitmore. Furthermore, restitution for the misappropriated wedding funds will be ordered." Her gavel struck the desk once clean and final. It was over. I felt the air leave my lungs in one long exhale, a sound between relief and disbelief. Reporters crowded the aisle, their cameras flashing, but I barely noticed. All I could see was Elaine sitting motionless, her face pale and drawn. Robert leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she didn't respond. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused, as if she couldn't comprehend the loss. As I left the courtroom, Dwyer placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. "You never raised your voice, and you never lost your ground. That's how you win." Outside, the light was bright, almost too bright. I paused on the courthouse steps, the sound of traffic and voices fading into the background. For so long, I had fought to prove I wasn't what they said I was: bitter, broken, unstable. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth had done it for me. I looked up at the sky, felt the warmth on my face, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt free, not just from the lies, but from the version of myself that believed being silent was the same as being kind. I had found my voice again, and it had spoken louder than all their noise. I'd won back more than a house, I'd won back myself. But winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like quiet, like walking into an empty room and realizing the echoes are your own. In the days after the verdict, I moved slowly through the house, touching everything, as if reacquainting myself with an old friend. The floors still creaked in the same places, the kitchen light still flickered if I turned it on too quickly, and the garden, wild and overgrown, still reached for the sun with the same stubborn hope. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was. The fear, the humiliation, the anger that had haunted these walls had finally loosened their hold. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe in my own home without tasting bitterness. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, I found a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of my husband's old college books. The latch was stiff with age, and inside were letters, some tied neatly with a ribbon, others loose and yellowed. Most were ours, written during our early years of marriage when we still believed that love could fix anything, but at the very bottom was one envelope unsealed, addressed to him in my own handwriting. I didn't remember writing it. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly faded, but the words were mine. I sat down on the attic floor and began to read. The letter wasn't dated, but the tone told me everything. It had been written years ago, sometime after his death, when grief still felt like a physical ache. I had written about loneliness, about how raising Michael alone was both my greatest joy and my hardest burden. And then, near the end, a paragraph I didn't expect to find, I saw Elaine at the store today. She still carries herself like she's owed something. Sometimes I wonder if she ever forgave me for what happened in college, or if I ever forgave her. I stopped reading, the words blurring, as memories resurfaced, ones I'd buried so deep I had almost convinced myself they weren't real. Elaine and I had known each other long before our children crossed paths. We'd been roommates in our first year at college, both studying education. We shared late-night coffees, traded secrets, even laughed about the same foolish boys. But there had been one man who wasn't foolish at all, my husband, Thomas. He'd dated Elaine briefly before he met me. She was beautiful, confident, the kind of woman who always seemed to know where she was going. But Thomas and I had found something quieter, steadier. When we married, she attended the wedding, but barely spoke to me. I told myself it was all in the past. I suppose for me it was. For her, it never was. Sitting there in the dust and sunlight, the truth settled in. All these years, Elaine's resentment hadn't begun with Michael or with property. It had begun with love. The humiliation at the wedding, the deceit, the cruelty. They were just the echoes of something far older, something she had never let die. I folded the letter gently and held it for a long moment. Then I took it downstairs. In the fireplace, the ashes from last winter's wood still lingered. I struck a match, touched it to the corner of the paper, and watched the flame crawl across the page. It burned quickly, curling inward as the ink turned black, the past dissolving into smoke. I didn't feel anger or regret, just release. I whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to him, but to the version of myself that had been trapped in that rivalry without even knowing it. Later that evening, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Michael step out. His shoulders slumped, a small bag in hand. He looked older, heavier in spirit, as if carrying the weight of everything that had happened. I opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, we just stood there. No words, no apologies, just a long, silent understanding passing between us. Then he said simply, "Do you still need help with the walls?" We spent the next few hours painting the living room. He worked in one corner, I in another, the faint sound of the radio filling the silence. At one point, he turned to me and said I should have asked questions sooner. I looked at him and smiled. "You did the best you could." It was enough. We didn't need to talk about the past anymore. The walls that had once held so much tension now gleamed with a fresh coat of paint, and for the first time in years, the house felt like home again. When he left that night, he kissed my cheek and said he'd come by next week to finish the trim. I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street, the sound of the engine fading into the quiet evening. I thought that peace at last had settled in. But as I turned back toward the kitchen, I saw a new envelope on the table, thin white with my name written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. There was no return address. Then came a letter that would test my peace again. It arrived the next morning, slipped neatly through the mail slot while I was brewing coffee. I almost didn't notice it at first, just another white envelope among the bills and catalogs. But when I turned it over and saw the handwriting careful, deliberate, with a faint slant, I recognized from the wedding invitations, I froze. It was from Samantha. I hadn't heard her name spoken aloud in nearly a year, and seeing it written there sent a ripple through the quiet of my kitchen. I set the mug down, untied the envelope flap with trembling fingers, and began to read. Mrs. Whitmore, the letter began. Not Helen, not Mom. The formality of it told me she was still finding her way. I know I'm the last person you expected to hear from. I wouldn't blame you if you tore this up without reading it. But I need to say what I should have said a long time ago. The paper was lined, her words neat but uneven, as if written through hesitation. After the trial, after the truth came out, I left my parents' house. I've been living in Portland, working at a small bakery. It's not glamorous, but it's quiet, and for the first time in my life, no one tells me what I'm supposed to be. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about who I was back then, and who I let myself become. I sat down at the table as I kept reading. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I see now what I couldn't see before. My mother taught me that power was control, that winning meant never admitting fault. I thought that was strength, but it wasn't. It was fear dressed up as pride. I envied you not because of Michael, but because you had peace. Even when we hurt you, you never screamed, never lashed out. I mistook that calm for weakness. Now I know it was the opposite. I didn't understand how much courage it takes to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty. The next lines were messier, the ink slightly smudged. I'm sorry for the things I did and for the silence that followed. I know I can't undo the harm, but I want to live differently now. If I ever have a daughter, I want her to see strength in gentleness, not in dominance. You taught me that without meaning to. The letter ended with one last sentence that caught me off guard. Thank you for standing your ground. You may have saved more than just yourself. I read the letter twice, then set it down. My first feeling wasn't anger or relief. It was an ache, deep and quiet, like pressing a bruise that had almost healed. Samantha had been cruel, yes, but she had also been young and caught in a web woven long before she was old enough to understand it. I thought of Elaine, proud and unbending, shaping her daughter in her image. Maybe the real tragedy wasn't just what Elaine had done to me, but what she had done to her own child. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the light shift across the yard. Outside, the maple tree was shedding the last of its leaves. I thought about all the ways forgiveness had been defined for me over the years as surrender, as weakness, as forgetting. But this felt different. This wasn't about excusing her. It was about letting go of the weight she'd left behind. Holding on to anger might have felt righteous, but it had kept me tied to a pain I no longer wanted to carry. That afternoon, I took out a clean sheet of stationery and began to write back. My words came slowly, carefully. Samantha. I began. I read your letter. Thank you for writing. I don't need to relive what happened, and I don't expect either of us to forget it. But I do want you to know this. I forgive you not for you, but for me. Because forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about releasing its hold on the present. You deserve to build a life that isn't built on your mother's anger, just as I deserve to live one not built on her shadow. I paused, then added, peace isn't something you find. It's something you decide to stop fighting. I signed my name, simply folded the paper, and slipped it into an envelope. As the sun began to set, I walked down the quiet street to the corner mailbox. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of autumn. When I dropped the letter through the slot, it made a soft sound almost like a sigh. I stood there for a long time watching the last bit of daylight fade over the rooftops, feeling something inside me unclench that I hadn't realized was still tight. Forgiveness didn't feel weak. It felt like freedom. In the weeks that followed my letter to Samantha, that freedom began to take shape in small, ordinary ways. I woke up earlier, opened the windows wider, and let sunlight fill the rooms I'd once kept dim. The house no longer felt like a fortress or a memory. It felt alive again. One morning, while baking blueberry muffins, the same kind Linda used to bring to the courthouse, I had an idea. It came quietly, like most meaningful things do. I wanted to build something lasting, something that could turn what I'd endured into something good. I didn't want revenge, not anymore. I wanted legacy. That's how Grace and Flower began. It started small, just a handful of women from the community center. Single mothers, retirees, women who'd lost their footing in life and didn't know how to begin again. We met in my kitchen every Saturday morning, flour dust floating in the air like snow laughter mingling with the smell of bread rising in the oven. I taught them what I knew: how to knead dough with patience, how to follow a recipe but leave room for forgiveness when it went wrong. The name came from Linda, who had insisted that Grace and Flower were the two things that could hold any life together. Word spread faster than I expected. The local newspaper wrote a small piece about us, calling it a kitchen of second chances. Soon after, a regional TV station filmed a short segment. They showed our little classes, the women rolling dough and smiling shyly at the camera. They even filmed the sign above my door, Grace and Flower, baking hope back into lives. I watched the segment later that week, sitting alone at the table, a cup of tea in hand. It was strange seeing my story framed by gentle music and soft lighting, but I didn't feel exposed anymore. I felt seen. Later, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that Elaine had watched the same broadcast. She lived in a smaller house, now quieter and lonelier, though I didn't take pleasure in that. The person who told me said she'd cried while watching it, her eyes wet as the reporter spoke about the women finding purpose in the kitchen that once held so much pain. I imagined her sitting there surrounded by the silence she'd once tried to fill with power and control, and for the first time, I didn't feel bitterness toward her. Karma had found her not through vengeance, but through the mirror of her own choices. That was justice enough for me. One autumn afternoon, a little girl from the class named Lucy came up to me while we were tending the small garden behind the center. We had planted a row of daisies, even though we both knew frost would take them soon. She was only 8, bright-eyed and curious, always asking the kind of questions that stopped me in my tracks. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, kneeling beside me, "why do we plant flowers if winter's just going to come and make them die?" I smiled, brushing soil from my hands. "Because they still bloom before the cold," I said softly, and so did I. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded as if she understood. Children have a way of seeing truth more clearly than grown-ups. As we watered the garden together, I realized I wasn't teaching these women just to bake. I was teaching them and myself that rebuilding isn't about avoiding the cold. It's about daring to bloom anyway. When the first snow came, I decided to hang a new sign over the porch. Michael helped me carve the letters, his hands steady and sure. He had moved back into town visiting, often sometimes bringing Samantha, who was still finding her own peace. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. It didn't need to be spoken for us to understand it. Together, we painted the sign white and gold, then fixed it above the door. It read simply, "Helen's home still standing." That night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, I sat with a notebook on my lap, writing down the names of every woman who had walked through my kitchen, each one carrying her own story of loss and strength. I realized then that the truest revenge isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you can still build, still grow, still love, despite what was done to you. I thought of Elaine again, not as an enemy, but as a woman who had never learned that lesson. I hoped somewhere deep inside she was learning it now. I hoped Samantha was baking something warm in her little apartment in Portland. I hoped peace, in its quiet way, had finally found us all. As I turned off the lights and looked at the glowing sign through the window, I felt something settle deep in my heart. Not victory, not even relief, but stillness. Maybe that's the only revenge worth taking, peace. And that's how it ended. Not with shouting, not with victory parades, but with peace. My story wasn't about revenge, after all. It was about learning that strength doesn't always come from fighting louder, but from standing quietly and refusing to break. If you've stayed with me through this journey, thank you for listening. Maybe you saw a bit of yourself somewhere along the way, a mother, a daughter, a friend who's had to start again after being hurt. If you did, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have chosen peace? Or would you still crave justice? Tell me in the comments below, because your thoughts matter, your voice matters, and your story might just help someone else find their own strength. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, true stories about love loss, and the quiet kind of courage that keeps us going, please subscribe to the channel. Every story we share together builds a little more understanding, a little more hope. Thank you for being here, for feeling with me, and for reminding me that even after everything, kindness still finds its way home.